So good evening, everyone. My name is Pauline Jones-Lewang. I am the director of the Digital Islamic Studies curriculum, or what we have recently decided to call DISC. And it is my sincere pleasure to welcome all of you tonight to this event and to introduce our eminent guest speaker, Dr. Syed Hossein Nasr. Dr. Nasr will be delivering the inaugural lecture for our distinguished lecture series in DISC, or Digital Islamic Studies curriculum. Before I introduce him, however, I'd like to give you a little bit of information about DISC, the Digital Islamic Studies curriculum. DISC is a collaboration between the University of Michigan and fellow members of the Committee on Institutional Cooperation, or the CIC, which includes the Big Ten universities as well as Chicago. The simple yet innovative idea behind DISC is to establish a shared curriculum in global Islamic studies via synchronous learning. By aggregating courses and expertise and making them available to students through existing digital technologies, we are making it possible for the first time for each of these member universities to provide a much broader Islamic studies curriculum than any single university could offer alone. During the proposed 5-year period of this initiative, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation, over a dozen undergraduate lecture courses and seminars will be developed and taught across multiple university departments, including religious studies, history, art history, comparative literature, anthropology, and political science. Dr. Syed Hossein Nasr has graciously agreed to help us launch the DISC initiative tonight with his lecture and with his presence, which has brought so many of you here tonight. And we are very grateful to him for this. So without further delay, let me introduce our esteemed guest. Professor Nasr is one of the world's leading experts on science and spirituality in Western academic and the Islamic world. He was born in Tehran, Iran, on April 7, 1933, and he received his education in both Iran and the United States and holds advanced degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Harvard University. He returned to Iran in 1958 and served as professor at Tehran University until 1979. While teaching at Tehran University, he served as Dean of the Faculty of Letters and Vice Chancellor. He also founded the Iranian Academy of Philosophy and served as its first president. During the tumultuous time of the Iranian Revolution, Professor Nasr returned to the United States and became University Professor of Islamic Studies at the George Washington University in 1984, and the president of the Foundation for Traditional Studies. Professor Nasr has written over 25 books and 500 articles in Persian, English, Arabic, and French. His works have been translated into many languages, including German, Spanish, Persian, Bosnian, Turkish, and Urdu. Perhaps his most important contribution, however, is the 3 generation of scholars that he has trained in the course of his 40-year scholarly career in Iran and in the West. Currently, Dr. Nasr leads an extremely active academic life with a very busy schedule of teaching at the university and lecturing at many institutions around the world. He writes scholarly works, and he's actively involved in several intellectual projects simultaneously. He also leads a very intense spiritual life spent in prayer, meditation, and contemplation while providing spiritual counsel for those who seek his advice and guidance. Exiled from his homeland, Dr. Nasr has found his home in the inviolable and sacred center, which is neither in the east nor the west. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Nasr to the stage. Thank you very much.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I know that the medieval practice of saying in nome Deo to begin lectures has ceased for a long time in Western universities, but I'm a Persian and Muslim, so I want to begin with the name of God. I want to thank the authorities of the University of Michigan for inviting me to inaugurate this very important series, which will concern the future of Islamic studies not only in this august university, but also, I'm sure, as a model for other universities throughout the United States. I was asked to speak about Islamic studies in America, most as a kind of a personal, biographical account of something with which I've been familiar and associated with since the 1950s. But the account that I'm going to give you tonight is not only anecdotal. I hope that it also contains some serious history of Islamic studies and where I think we will be going in the future. As all of you, or many of you know, the origin of Islamic studies in this country really begins in the 17th century, with the teaching of Arabic at Harvard, and later on when Yale University was established. These are the two oldest chairs of Arabic in this country, and at that time Arabic was taught as an aid for Semitic languages and not because of its Islamic content. But nevertheless, it brought with it interest in very different aspects of Islam, and this continued in the 17th, 18th century when Princeton was established. There also a chair of Arabic was created. Then in the late 19th century, missionary activity began to become very active in the Islamic world, and the center at Harvard was created as a missionary center with a very great scholar like Duncan MacDonald, who was probably the greatest American scholar of Islamic studies in those days, residing there. But also missionaries like Zwemmer, who were really great enemies of Islam, but who wrote a lot about Islam, and their books were widely read. And they published a journal which was called The Muslim World, M-O-S-L-E-M, which finally, after pressure from Muslims and also American scholars who were not Muslims but were serious scholars, was changed to The Muslim World, which is the oldest, actually, journal in the English language in America concerned with Islamic studies, and which still goes on. Originally, Islamic studies was part of what was called Oriental studies. And the first center that was established for Islamic studies seriously was under that rubric before the Second World War at Princeton University, Center of Oriental Studies, run by T. Collier Young, who was a scholar of Persian, an Iranist, he and his son both. His son was mostly an archaeologist, but he himself was a historian and also a scholar of the Persian language and also knew Arabic. And so the Princeton Center, in a sense, has precedence historically in the modern period as far as Islamic studies is concerned. At that time, there were several different currents which influenced American study of Islam. First of all, America had no interest in the Islamic world politically. It was not a colonial power like Britain and France or Holland were in Holland and, of course, Indonesia, and the French and the British all over North Africa and Asia and other places. It had no colonial interest, but the interest came from several different channels. One was simply to follow European scholarship. Most American universities in the 19th century in the field of religion were deeply influenced not only by English but especially by German universities and the development of what was called Religionswissenschaft at that time in Germany and Religionsgeschichte, which were very historical and you might say detailed accounts of religions without any interest whatsoever in what religion itself is. I shall get to this point in a moment. This is quite important. And another current was, of course, interest in missionary activity. Another current was philological because of the importance of Arabic for all Semitic languages. And therefore, it's very interesting that the early Jewish yeshivas and centers of Jewish studies emphasized the teaching of Arabic as well. As you know, all good scholars of Judaism who are scholars of Hebrew know Arabic. So some of the best Arabists in the world are Jewish professors at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. They have incredible knowledge of Arabic because of the importance of Arabic philologically for Hebrew itself, not to speak about historically the influence of Arabic writings on Judaism in the field of Kalam, that is scholastic theology, philosophy, the sciences. You could not have had even the Zohar, the great work which is central to the Kabbalah in Spain, without the knowledge of Arabic that the Kabbalists adopted. So Arabic and Hebrew went together very much, and despite the enmity that began after 1948, Jewish studies in America themselves contributed to the rise of more interest in Arabic studies and therefore also Islamic studies. Persian is a different case. Persian was left out to a large extent until after the Second World War. America did not produce a major scholar of Persian until a few decades ago. I should mention that in a moment. With the Second World War, a very important change took place. That is, I do not like to use the word colonial power because Americans don't like to use it, but in a sense, America replaced Britain and France as the most important Western colonial power, or power present, if you like to use it, in many places, including the Middle East. And so the United States found itself as a world power for the first time. And one of the very first programs that was promulgated under the presidency of President Truman, right after the Second World War, was the creation of regional study centers, especially Middle Eastern study centers. This was both a boon and a tragedy for Islamic studies. I should mention that in a moment. What happened was that 14 universities were chosen, including University of Michigan, and Harvard, and Berkeley, and University of Texas, and Utah. I don't want to take your time to mention all 12 of them, but a major university right across the continent, from San Francisco to Cambridge, Massachusetts, 14 universities were chosen, and the State Department gave a large amount of money to start Middle Eastern studies programs. And so these programs began to sprout everywhere in these 14 places, 14 universities, all major universities in this country. And what happened, the positive aspect of it was that for the first time there was money to employ people, to bring people who were scholars of the Middle East, to bring new Arabists and so forth, and also some Persian and Turkish along the side with Arabic, along with Arabic. But at the same time, the concentration was really on not only the Middle East, which is not the whole of the Islamic world, but not even the whole history of Islam. There was a course taught at Harvard in the Center of Middle Eastern Studies, which we always joke about. I founded the Harvard Islamic Society in 1954 when I went there. I was its president until I graduated from Harvard and went back to Iran. So I was right in the middle of this. It was an introductory course taught at Harvard, the premier university of this country, which was a full-year course. And on the Middle East studies, the history of the Middle East, the first term was from Nasr to Jamal Abdel Nasser. And the second term was for Nasr to the present. Nasr was still living in Cairo. In myopia, unbelievable myopia. So actually, things seriously Islamic were just skipped over more or less. And also a great tension was created. A great tension was created between this approach to Middle Eastern studies and the classical, philological, historical, Orientalistic approach to the study of Islam. An issue of studying religion as religion I shall mention in a moment. That also comes in very quickly. So in a sense, you began to get, from the 1950s on, a tension in these universities between the classical Orientalist tradition that came from Europe, and mostly from Germany, secondly England, and less so from France. But nevertheless, some scholars also came from France, of course. But some of the greatest scholars of Europe who fled the disasters and tragedies of the Second World War came to America in so many fields, including the field of Islamic studies, people like von Grunebaum, Rosenthal. I mean, those are the greatest scholars of Germany in the field of Islamic studies. They migrated to this country. Von Grunebaum became the head of the center at UCLA. Franz Rosenthal went to Yale, and other lesser-known figures. I will not burden you with them. Also some Arabs who migrated, including Professor Hourani, who used to teach here once, great Christian Arab scholar. So this migration of the Second World War strengthened also Islamic studies, but also strengthened this Orientalism that was part and parcel of the way that Europeans looked upon Islamic studies in the 19th century and the early 20th century. But America began to look more upon Islamic studies from the point of view of the social sciences. And a tension set in which still goes on, very much so. Because the social sciences, as created in the West in the 19th century, are not at all suitable for the study of religion. Everybody's discovered that. I mean, religion itself, not religion as social phenomenon, religion as religion. Religion is all the field in universities in which people try to study the field without the field. I mean, if you study physics, you're a physicist, you're studying physics. But if you study religion, you're not supposed to be interested in religion. Otherwise, you're not a good professor of religion. And so religion was really reduced to its external phenomena. either literary or social. Anyway, tension set in between Orientalism, which based itself essentially on historicism and on philology, and the new social sciences which came from America to Europe. That is the Islamic social sciences, so-called. And most of the people who, like Leonard Binder of the University of Chicago, right nearby, William Polk, these people were famous American Islamicists who tried to accentuate and confirm the social scientific way of approach to Islamic studies, also became very powerful, and a tension set in between that old Orientalism and this social sciences. And into this fray stepped a new phenomenon which has to do with phenomenology. Now, I know all of you are not philosophers in this room, and I have to be very careful not to get into deep waters about this, but it's absolutely essential to mention it. What we call phenomenology in the history of philosophy was founded by Edmund Husserl, the famous early 20th century German philosopher, whose view was that when you study something, you must study the phenomenon in itself, and its influence upon that phenomenon are secondary. And so this, of course, I've just summarized in one sentence, phenomenology is a very serious and important school of Western philosophy, which finally flowered in a new way with Martin Heidegger, who was really indirectly a student of Husserl. And this school opposed both the historicism of European Orientalism and the social scientific approach to the study of religion. Now, the comments I'm going to make involves all religions, but it also includes Islam, but I have to do it. So the debate began how to study religion, not only Islam, but other religions. And the idea came up, which America gave to Europe. Most of the influences would be coming from Europe to America, but this time it went from America to Europe. That is the idea of how to study world religions. First of all, the very term world religion came into being. You don't see it in the literature of 1925. Nobody ever uses it. The idea that you have these global religions like Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, even Judaism, which is small in number, but global, and Confucianism, and so forth and so on, and how to study them. How do you study religion? A great debate took place, which rent asunder really the whole fabric of academic study of religion for a while. And the views that were expressed were either those of Orientalists who wanted to study religion from the point of view of its history and philology. The very brilliant Arab Christian writer, Edward Said of Columbia University, who died of cancer a few years ago, as all of the scholars in this room know, and some of the older graduate students, when he was alive, he wrote this book called Orientalism, which is one of the most famous and important books written by a Western, although it was originally Palestinian, but a person living in the West on this issue. And then he wrote, just before his death, a book called Covering Islam. It's a brilliant book, using the word covering in two ways. To cover something like a newspaper covers a story can also mean to cover it over. And so these two books, in a sense, brought a new argument in the field of studying religions in academia throughout the United States, in every major university, including here at that time. So the debate set out, and I want to clarify for you what the main parameters are and why Islamic studies suffered from this very important debate. I said the question was, how do we study religion? What is religion? They developed at that time two very powerful opposing forces. Those who wanted to cling to the older European idea that when you study religion, you study its history. This historicism, which the West adopted and learned from 19th century German philosophy, from Hegel and people like that, in which it's still today, University of Michigan or Harvard or George Washington, wherever I teach, you don't study any subject except the sciences. You only study its history. You don't study philosophy as philosophy, you study the history of philosophy. You don't study literature, it's the history of literature. You would say, oh, I'm studying 19th century Russian literature. I'm studying Dostoevsky, one of the greatest scholars who came from Russia in the 50s, who used to teach Dostoevsky here. Michigan became famous for the study of 19th century Russian literature. It was not literature as such, it was 19th century literature. Try to time everything, try to bind everything to a temporal sequence of events. This is the heart of historicism. And then against this came this idea, which grew out of the Religionswissenschaft in Germany, both of them grew, of phenomenology, in which time was totally irrelevant. Time was totally irrelevant. What was important is the phenomenon that takes place. Study the phenomenon in itself, irrespective of history. I remember once my good friend Henri Corbin in France, who called himself a phenomenologist, who translated Martin Heidegger for the first time from German into French. What's the Stats Métaphysique? He translated Qu'est-ce que c'est que la métaphysique, which was the first book of Heidegger to appear in French, and all of French existentialism, including Jean-Paul Sartre, who was an atheist, in contrast to Corbin, who believed in the 12th Imam. But it says that he owed it to Corbin to discover existentialism. But this way of looking at things, Corbin said, Dr. Nasr, we have all these debates going on in Europe. Let's have you and I sit down and write an anti-history of anti-philosophy in Islam. We were at that time writing together, started with Islamic, the book that's very famous of Islamic philosophy, and he made this joke, which is very, very pertinent, very important, that is how to get out of this trap of historicism, at the same time not reduce phenomenology to what the Dutch school and the Swedish school, such very famous phenomenologists of Van der Loo and Wiedengren, who was called the prince of the scholars of religion from the University of Uppsala in Sweden, had done. That is, to take away from religion its historicity and reduce it to simply the phenomena that have occurred. Now, both of these gained followers. There were fights over it in every university, practically, as serious department of religion. And in this debate, which is not the subject tonight, and therefore I just allude to it, but in this debate, what happened to Islam? Islam could not be fitted into either model. Let me explain this to you, why this was so difficult for Islamic studies. If you accept the historical, which many Western scholars, including Christian scholars and Jewish scholars, accepted, especially Christian scholars, they said, oh, we study the history of religion, which shows a gradual progress of religion. But at that time, the idea of progress was still around. Progress of religion ending with Christianity. So, and even Hegel says that in the book Phenomenology of Religion. You have early religions, and then you have the Greek religion and so forth and so on, and finally you end up with Christianity, the perfect religion. Then you have a very, very embarrassing postscript, and that is Islam. If you accept that view, then what do you do with Islam? Then, because it's not a minor religion of a few 100,000 people, it's a major world religion. That means if religion progresses, that means also religion has progressed past Christianity to Islam. So in a sense, this very view eclipsed the study of Islam seriously. The other view of phenomenology also was very good for studying, for example, the phenomenon of sacrifice, the phenomenon of kingship. There are many books like this written in various religions. But they could not deal easily with a religion like Judaism, for example, not only Islam, which is much, even more than Islam, a historical religion based on the sacred history of the Jewish people. And Islam also rises in the full light of history. And it's not a mythological religion. Phenomenology is much more successful in dealing with religions which use a mythological language. And even in Hinduism, it's much more successful in dealing with the mythical aspect of Hinduism than with Shankaracharya and Hindu metaphysics. You cannot deal with it. If you look at all the books written by phenomenologists on India, you will see how weak that other aspect of Hinduism is. Now, when you turn to Islam, Islam expresses truths not in myths, but in metaphysical and theological ideas. It's not that there are no symbols in the Quran. A symbol and a myth are not the same thing. A symbol and a myth. No language can be without the language of symbolism. But a myth is quite something else. A myth is a lived symbol, like the myth of the sacrifice of Purusha, let's say in Hinduism. And in a sense, the phenomenologists considered even the sacrifice of Christ as a kind of myth in the phenomenological sense. And a lot of Christians were therefore against them also for this very reason. Now, Islam did not fare well in their treatment. You do not have a single major scholar of phenomenology who has written anything significant on Islam. Not a single phenomenologist. There are only two exceptions, and they only use the term in a different way. One is Henri Corbin, one is Anna Maria Schimmel, the famous German scholar who was professor at Harvard and who died in a bathtub, unfortunately, a few years ago, fell and died. What a great tragedy. Unbelievable linguist and scholar of Islam. And she has a book called The Phenomenology of Islam, and Corbin says, I'm a phenomenologist. But when we asked Corbin and Anna Maria Schimmel, what do you mean by phenomenology? Both of them said, we mean kashf al-mahjub. That is an Islamic term which means casting aside the veil which covers things, which is very, very different from the way we use phenomenology in universities and in books of philosophy. So to cut the story short, in this debate that was going on, neither school could pay much attention to Islam. As I said, you have these great books written by American phenomenologists about Hinduism or Buddhism. The greatest of them all, Mircea Eliade at the University of Chicago, was a very good friend, a Romanian scholar, unbelievable scholar of religion. He himself was a very close friend of mine. He always used to say, it's very hard for me to deal with Islam. He wrote all these remarkable books about Australian Aborigines all the way down to Hinduism. His book on Hinduism is just remarkable. On Buddhism, on Eastern Christianity, he was a Romanian Orthodox originally, then went to India and became a neo-Hindu. He never wrote anything on Islam of any consequence whatsoever. And so he was a very good friend of mine. Once we were participating together in the Congress of World Religions, I said, Professor Eliade, why don't you write anything about Islam? He said it doesn't fit into my method of studying religions. He was a good scholar that was honest. He was honest enough to say that this method does not apply to Islam. Now, this situation is what you find in the 1960s. And then at that time, there comes along a number of events which are very, very important for the understanding of Islamic studies in America today. First of all, an American scholar called Kenneth Craig, who was professor of Colgate University, received funds from an American lady who knew nothing about Islam or anything else, but who was very much interested in studying religions from their own point of view, to study religion as religion. And she set up that center at Colgate University for the study of religion. It was the very, very first with this philosophy. And then she paid a good amount of money to Harvard University at the Center for the Study of World Religions to establish that center, that building that looks like an inn. It was a very, very important institution from the point of view of what it started, because Harvard was Harvard. And I was in on this from the very beginning. I was the first visiting professor at Harvard for this program. I spent the whole year, almost the whole year there for that reason. I didn't want to leave Iran, I would have been there permanently. The center tried to study religions from their own point of view. And it met with tremendous opposition. Professor Morton White, who was one of the most famous American philosophers, a positivist, a logical positivist, wrote a letter to President Pusey of Harvard saying that we do not want to have the radioactive rain of religion descend upon the Harvard campus. That's the saying of a professor of philosophy from Harvard University to President Nathan Pusey, president of Harvard. I saw the letter, Pusey showed it to me. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? Nevertheless, the center was established. The center was established, and the person who played the most important role was a Canadian-American scholar, Wilfred Cantwell Smith. We cannot forget him when we talk about Islamic studies. This man was in his youth a communist, a leftist. He was a Marxist. He was without religion. He went to Pakistan because he liked to study Urdu. And there he encountered Islam. And his life changed completely. He became a Christian again, but very pro-Islamic, because for him Islam was what brought him back to Christianity. And he became a very famous scholar himself. He wrote books on Islam in India and later on comparative religion. He's probably the most famous scholar of North America in comparative religion, because Eliade is not really from this continent. He came from Romania. I would say Edward Cantwell Smith is the #1 scholar in this field who was influential. They brought him to Harvard, to the center, of world religions. And there began a new wave of taking religion seriously as themselves. And this had a very, very important effect upon Islamic studies as religious studies, not only philology and history and archaeology and God knows what, but as religious studies. And also the second figure who played a very important role in this, I have to mention, was another Smith, Houston Smith, the author of The World's Religions. And I have to tell, I was supposed to tell you a lot of personal anecdotes, but I decided to say very few, but this one I will tell you. If you look at the first edition of Houston Smith's World Religions, the chapter on Islam is practically zero. It's inconsequential, extremely weak. When the Iranian Revolution occurred, I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts a few months later, and he was professor at MIT. He asked me if I would give a lecture on Islam, which I did. And later on, in 1961, when I was professor at Harvard, 61, 62, he asked me again, and the second lecture I gave at MIT, he said, now for the first time I understand what Islam is. And he and I became very good friends. I'm not completely free to talk about his private life, but he entered in the whole Islamic universe. And the second edition of the World's Religion, which is the most widely sold book on religion in the English language. It sold 2 million copies. You see the difference in the treatment of Islam. And he played a very, very important role in the latter part of his life. So we talk about Islamic studies. These two key figures within the domain of religious studies are very, very important. Another event that took place that involves me personally was that of all the major centers for the study of religions, it was Temple University in Philadelphia that decided that they would have a faculty, body of faculty, in which Christians would teach Christianity, Jews would teach Judaism, Muslims would teach Islam, Hindus would teach Hinduism, and so forth. And the religions would be taken seriously as religions. When I first migrated to this country, I've taught for a few months at the University of Utah. It was the middle of the year, an unbelievable year. And I was offered several positions to go to different places. And for a while I taught at Harvard, but it was not what I wanted. The position they offered is not what I wanted. So they offered me to go to Temple. I accepted. For 5 years I taught there. And it was a remarkable experience. There are some of the world's leading scholars, the Catholic scholar like Sloyan, leading Catholic theologian, taught as a Catholic theologian, that he taught Catholicism as a Catholic. And the Protestants. The late Ismail al-Farouqi was assassinated in Philadelphia in 1986, and myself taught Islam. We had 120 PhD students, more than all of the other universities in the United States put together in Islamic studies, mostly from Indonesia and Malaysia, but also 2 from Iran, but a lot from the Arab world and from Pakistan. Some of them are among the greatest scholars in the Islamic world today. Many people did their PhDs with me there. And we had an ambience in which I was free to teach Islam as Islam. I taught mainly Islamic philosophy and metaphysics, but I also taught Islam itself and Sufism and all kinds of things. And there was no inhibition that you have to follow some Dutch man's method of teaching Islam who doesn't know whether Islam is Sin or Salah, just in Persian, who knows nothing about it. So the Temple experience was also a very, very important experience, not only for me, but in the United States, so because other universities gradually began to follow suit. About this time also, that is from the mid-60s up to the 70s, another important event took place. And that is the migration for the first time to America of Islamic scholars of note, who were strong enough to teach at universities. This began with the exile of Fazlur Rahman, a very important Pakistani scholar who wrote something and caused his house to be burned. He was a very good friend of mine, especially Islamic philosophy. I kept telling him, don't give any fatwas, you're not a mufti. But the government had opted him and asked him to give a fatwa on some people they liked, so they burned his house, and he left Pakistan, became professor at the University of Chicago. Fazlur Rahman played a very important role in this new phase of Islamic studies, in which I would have a major Islamic professor teaching Islamic studies as he did. And he was soon followed by Ismail al-Farouqi, a Palestinian who politically sided along with the Salafis and so forth in order to thought that we would regain Palestine that way. But actually, intellectually, he was a very honest and sincere man, a very good Muslim. He didn't like Sufism. He said, I don't like Sufism. I said, in Spain, it was so important. What do I do with Spain? This kind of thing. And we always fought together about this. But he was a very good man. I said, I'm just a soldier in the city. He said, no, you're a general, except that what you're doing I don't like very much. But he was always open to it. He did a great deal of service also in making serious Islamic studies. For a while also with the Social University of Michigan for a short period of time. And then, as God would have it, I landed in this country in 1979 against my own wishes. I could have become a professor at Harvard many times, Princeton, they wanted me, but I did not want to leave Iran under any condition whatsoever. I didn't know that one day God would decide otherwise. And so I landed here, and I have played a humble role at those other men are dead. I've been always said we three people started the new period of Islamic studies in which a lot of Muslim students now began to study Islamic studies. They never did it before. The Muslims have made a great mistake, and I mention this here because we're near Dearborn, Michigan, which is one of the biggest centers of Islam in this country, and Michigan has the highest percentage of Muslims of any state in the Union. I have to mention this. One of the most brilliant things that the Jewish people did, and I always said the Muslims should learn from them, is that when they migrated from Germany and Central Europe, all Jewish families, not all, almost all of them, were small bourgeois. They were watchmakers and shopkeepers and things like that. They were not great scholars. There were a few, of course. Well, Einstein also came. I'm not saying there were none. But the majority were ordinary Jewish families who were not great scholars. But they all, when they had several sons, would put one, of course, to be a doctor. That's why they took over medicine in America. One to be a lawyer. They took over law. They're, mashallah, so intelligent in these matters. But also always have one son go to the field of Jewish studies. They would have one son go to the field of Jewish studies. And look what happened. I always tell this story. When I was at Harvard, there were only a couple of Jewish professors who taught Judaism. Name me one university today where a non-Jew is teaching Jewish studies. That's a remarkable achievement. And more power to them. I have a lot of rabbi friends in New York. I said, mashallah, we should learn from you. What happens in Islam, among the Muslims is absolute tragedy. But things began to change slowly from that time. Why a tragedy? Because all Muslims want their sons to be doctors. No woman would marry anybody who's not a doctor. Anyone who wants to ask for a girl's hand, are you a doctor or not? I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not too much. But not too much. And if not that, engineer. Law was unimportant in the Islamic world. They didn't realize the importance of law. Otherwise, it would have been very important for the Islamic community to have a large number of Muslim lawyers. But the parents pushed their children toward the field of medicine or engineering. And if any child wanted to do Islamic studies, you cannot imagine what would happen. I mean, I have so many personal stories. I've tried to tell myself not to tell too many personal stories, but these are parts of history. I once had a very brilliant young Pakistani student, about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, came to my class. He was a pre-med. He was studying to study medicine. As soon as he took my very first class on Islam, he said, I want to go into the field of Islamic studies. 2 days ago, I received a letter from his father, a distinguished doctor. Dr. Nasr, yes, salam alaikum, alaikum assalam. Listen, what is happening? My son is going to not be a doctor, is going to be an Islamic scholar. And his mother had just fainted in the kitchen when she told her that. This is what has been going on. And this is the great problem of the Islamic community, which they have to solve. But from the 80s onward, gradually you began to get a change. I myself have given over 30 PhDs in the last 30 years, 35 years I've been teaching in this country, to Muslim students, 40 of them, and many of them MAs. And now we're now training a whole new generation of Muslim scholars. But it's important to know that this began actually from the 1980s onward, and it's a process still in the making, as a long, long ways to go. Now let me turn to the growth of Islamic studies after the 80s, leading up to our own day. the growth of Islamic studies in this country continued very strong in certain fields, such as philology, Arabic, later on Persian and Turkish, history, a little bit religious thought, little bit, but very little concerning the intellectual aspects of Islam. The hippie revolution brought a great deal of interest for Sufism to this country. There's no doubt about that. I was invited from Iran to give a talk at the Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, organized by Jacob Needleman at the height of the hippie movement on Sufism. And there were about 4,000 people in the cathedral. When I walked out, there were 100 people who kept pursuing me. I would go this street, they would come that street, that cross street, all across. I said, Professor, who are these people? He said, these are your new disciples. Then everybody in San Francisco is a Sufi. So this element began to enter, there's no doubt about that. A lot of universities began to show interest, and for the first time from the 70s onward, a very important event took place. Important Islamic books written by Muslims began to be taken seriously in Western universities and taught. Don't want to talk about my own humble writings, put it on the other side. Other people. If you look at the curriculum of universities, Michigan, Harvard, Yale, any major university, UCLA, University of California and Berkeley, look at the syllabus of the course on Islam until the 1970s. There are practically no Muslim names. Maybe a translator of the Quran, Yusuf Ali or something like that. But the books on Islam were all written by Westerners. And on Sufism, this began to change. This began to change along several lines. And books began to appear which were taken seriously by universities and which began to be taught. Since I'm supposed to be autobiographical, I hate to say it, but I had a very small role to play in this. I gave 3 lectures at Harvard University, the Center for Study of World Religions, of which I was the first scholar, called 3 Muslim Sages, which was immediately published by the Harvard University Press. It was the first book ever published by Harvard on Islam by a Muslim scholar. Can you imagine the great Harvard University had not published one book by a Muslim scholar before? The university which has Sir Hamilton Gibb and all these people in it. But that's how things were at that time. We now take it for granted. And alhamdulillah, other scholars, much better than myself, came along and gradually began to get a literature in the English language and also in French, which is very, very important, written by Muslims. And not only Muslims who sold themselves and were just Western scholars with a Muslim name. I mean, people who had their roots in the Islamic tradition. Although, of course, not everybody thinks alike. They had many different versions of what they wanted to say, different from what somebody might write at Al-Azhar. I'm not saying that. But there were Muslims, serious Muslim scholars. And this also began about that time. But also a tragedy occurred, which again I have to point out. Look at all these universities in the United States, all these Islamic studies programs that have arisen. Why is it that the American universities in this field have not been able to produce the scholars that Europe has produced? Why is it there are no Americans, Sir Hamilton Gibbs and Louis Massignons and Louis Gardez and Anna Maria Schimmels and people like that? I will tell you why. It is not because of lack of will. It's something more profound than that. And since we have heads of departments here, I hope they will listen to our advice of 50 years of experience in this field. In America, most of Islamic studies is done horizontally. It doesn't build up. It doesn't build up. In a little country like Holland or Sweden, University of Uppsala, you only have usually one professor of Islamic studies and 1 or 2 students, but they build up like a pyramid, step by step. So the one student that comes out to be like Professor Heinrichs, the best Arabist of Germany of his time, who just died of cancer at Harvard. And when Harvard was looking for the best Arabists, where did they go? They went to Germany. The university where Heinrich studied had only 1 or 2 students in Arabic. It's not a question of quantity. It's a question of structure, at being able to build up, not just be on the horizontal level. If you were to ask me, who are the American scholars who can compare with the greatest European scholars in the field of Islamic studies, I can only name 3 or 4 people. One of them used to teach here, Oleg Grabar, professor of the history of Islamic art. Although I do not at all agree with his interpretation of Islamic art, he was a very close friend of mine. We taught a course together at Harvard when I first came to America on Islamic art. But he had no understanding of the philosophy of Islamic art, but he was a remarkable scholar of the history of Islamic art, a world-class scholar. His father also, a very famous scholar of Byzantine art. And then a professor who unfortunately died at the age of 55, who probably would have been the greatest American historian of Islam, Marshall Hodgson of the University of Chicago, who wrote the 3-volume Venture of Islam that was brought out after his death. But incredible work that compared with the best of Europeans. And a person in whom I take great pride, my own student, William Chittick, who I consider to be the greatest scholar in this country of Sufism, of intellectual aspects of philosophical Sufism, and no one knows Persian like he does. I don't know of any American or European who knows Persian like he does. But why there's so few? There might be 1 or 2 others. I mean, they're good scholars, but people who can stand up to the best scholars in the world with all the money that is spent, all the centers that exist, my advice is to pay attention to building a pyramid that is going up in stages, starting with 12 students, then 10 students, then finally 3, 4 students after several years who are really top-notch. Look at all these PhDs from Harvard. Where are they? Why haven't we heard of them? I criticize my own university. I'm a Harvard graduate and I've taught there. I would not say anything about Princeton or anywhere else. The same thing everywhere else. Where are they? A good scholar is like a diamond. It shines. It doesn't hide. One good article written by a gifted scholar, it noticed all over the world. Where are all these people? Why don't we produce the Hamilton Gibbs anymore? People say, oh, there are too many things to read, too much bifurcation of knowledge. That's not enough of an excuse. That's not enough of an excuse. So we do have this problem with Islamic studies that has not been cured yet. But inshallah, it will be cured soon. Now, another point about Islamic studies, which I was very glad to hear that is being changed at Michigan right now, is that for a long, long time in the West, and Arab nationalism took advantage of it, people thought that Islamic studies was Arabic studies. And if you go to University of Louvain in Belgium, where they've been teaching Arabic for 700 years, everything Islamic is called Arabic. Ibn Sina is called Arabic. He never visited the Arab world even, never came to Baghdad. He was a Persian. He was not an Arab. And there are many others. I don't want to be chauvinistic here, but this is the truth of the matter. The truth of the matter. Islamic philosophy, 9/10 of all great Islamic philosophers are Persian, but it's called Arabic philosophy. In the Middle Ages, it was fine. I always say this. Let's remember, there are many scholars in this room. I'm not criticizing what Louvain is doing. It's a Catholic university going back to the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, Roger Bacon, who was an Englishman, was called a Latin philosopher. He was not Latin. He was not Italian or Spanish. That was another meaning. That's a linguistic, not ethnic and nationalistic connotation, which it has gained. And that has been one of the very, very grave problems that, in fact, has prevented the Middle East Islamic studies in this country from having to do with all of the Islamic world. I've took many courses at Harvard, but the great Sir Hamilton Gibbs himself on Islam and Islamic history. Nothing was said, not a word was said about Sumatra, about Java, about Malaya, about Bengal, about Central Asia a little bit, Samarkand and Bukhara, because part and parts of the Persian world. I was just saying, if you count, there are over 800 million Muslims living east of Afghanistan. 800 million Muslims. That's not a small number. It's half the world Muslim population, perhaps a little bit more than half. Very, very large number. In almost no university does Islamic studies cover them. You have separate South Asian studies, Southeast Asian is a very good university. But Islam as a whole this exclusion, and not only that side, but also Black Africa. All these years I studied the history of Islam, not a word was said about Senegal, about Mali, about Niger. These countries have been Muslim for 700 years. It's not a recent event. For a long, long time, nothing was said. Nothing. Well, Senegal later, but these other places for centuries on it. This is one of the major problems with equating Middle Eastern studies with Islamic studies. Now, turning to the future, I want to start with this very point. If we're going to have serious Islamic studies, it must be Islamic studies. If a Center for Christian Studies, which only deals with the Baptist Church, why don't you call it Center of Baptist Studies? Fine. But if the Center of Christian Studies, there are other Christians than Baptists. Not only are there Protestants, there are Orthodox, there are Catholics, there are Eastern churches. So let's not misname things. If we're going to have Islamic studies, it must cover from the Moros of the Philippines to Senegal and everything in between, and going north all the way to Siberia and coming down to the center of Africa. It covers a very vast world. I hope that Michigan will be the first university in this country where Islamic studies will be the study of the Islamic world. Not just the Arab world, not just the Arab and Persian world, not just the Arab, Persian, and the Ottoman world. That's the most. These are, yes, the center of Islamic civilization. For a long, long time, the center of Islamic civilization was from Cairo to Lahore, with Iran in the middle. Persia was a very great center from which so many influences flowed both ways. And then the exception of Iberia, Spain, for a period, which was a very great cultural and intellectual center. But the Islamic world is not only that. Black African studies are not at all integrated into Islamic studies. I myself am very ashamed of myself. I'm supposed to be a scholar of Islam. How much do I know about the history of Black Africa? Yes, I've read about Bamba and great Sufis and the Tijaniya order spreading from Morocco into Senegal because that's my field. But I was never given training in this. And I've been many times to Malaysia and I've also been to Indonesia, understanding about that part of the Islamic world, but this is never taught. Whoever teaches a course on the history of Malay Islam as part of Islamic history, even big books on Islamic history, even Venture of Islam of Marshall Hodgson, which is such a wonderful book, deals with the central area of the Islamic world. And yes, that's very important. I just said, from Cairo to Lahore, with all these cities like Isfahan and Shiraz and the Persian Marv and all these Khorasan, all these things in between, but the heartland of the Islamic world. And I've always said that like a mountain, when it rains on top of the mountain, then the rain comes down and inundates all the fields around it. All the influences went from the central area to the rest of the Islamic world. I accept that. The works of Ghazali, who lived in Khorasan, are not only taught in Cairo, but were also taught in Timbuktu. The manuscripts of Ghazali in Timbuktu, if this Boko Haram have not destroyed, God forbid, one of the greatest centers of Islamic manuscripts, what they're doing to it. It's a great tragedy to know too much these days. It's better to be ignorant in a certain sense. I know what happened when the Umayyad mosque was destroyed in Aleppo. I wish I had never slept there overnight. And I'd experienced that incredible building. It's like taking your liver out of your body. But I will not get into that. But Timbuktu, people knew Ghazali in Timbuktu. But scholars in Timbuktu were not known in Khorasan. The cultural landscape of the Islamic world was like this mountain. It was the central part, especially Persia and then cities going all the way east to Lahore perhaps, a little bit sometimes to Delhi, and west to Cairo, were the centers from which all the cultural, philosophical, intellectual, legal elements flowed. Now, two of our Persian ulama are sitting in the first row. They studied in Qom, I'm sure. All the books they studied were written either by Persians or Arabs of nearby, from Iraq or Syria or Egypt. Unless they studied Ibn Arabi or something like that at night, clandestinely, the teacher finding out. Of course, Ibn Arabi was from Andalusia, but that's an exception. But the books, even great books of fiqh written by Sanusi, things like that, are not known in the central land of the Islamic world. This I accept. But we're supposed to be scholars of the 21st century with objectivity. So Islamic world, first of all, means the Islamic world. I think in the future, that's one of the most important goals that we should point to and we should aim for. I was very happy to hear your comments about the University of Michigan in the last 4 or 5 years taking a step in this direction. The University of Michigan in the 50s and 60s was also a leader in many, and for example, Islamic art. Before Grabar came to Harvard and stole him from Michigan, this was the greatest center for Islamic art in America. And I hope, inshallah, God willing, you will be again a leader in this way of trying to introduce into the American scene an understanding of the Islamic world, or do not speak about the Islamic world. Fine. Have a program on Egypt or Iran or whatever you want. That's something else. Now, how do I see, because my time is running out, and I don't want to tire you out, just a few more moments of your time. How do I see the future of Islamic studies in America? I was asked to say something about this. Being a Muslim, I believe that future is in God's hands. And almost everything I've predicted for the future has come out to be wrong. Futurists made millions of dollars, Toffler and people like that. Where are they? All the things that we read about 30 years ago, none of them happened. So it's all in God's hands. But to the extent that we human beings are supposed to use our aql, our intellect, and try to extrapolate from what we know to what's going to happen, at least in the near future, I see both remarkable opportunities and great obstacles for Islamic studies in this country. First of all, the obstacles. Why obstacles? Every religion, besides Protestantism, that came to America confronted opposition. It's interesting, Protestantism did not confront opposition of the American Indians. They received them well in Virginia and in Massachusetts. But after that, in the 1850s and 60s, when you have a big wave of Italian and Irish Catholics migrated into America, tremendous opposition from Protestants. Then the Catholics became Americanized and homegrown and became part of the American fabric. Then came the Orthodox. From the 1890s and the wars in Greece, they were much smaller number than the Catholics, but first also they were ostracized by both the Catholics and the Protestants, although they were Christians, until gradually they found a niche for themselves. They're not as popular as Orthodox as Catholics, but there's a lot of interest in Orthodoxy today in America because of the authenticity of much of their teachings. 4 or 5 of my best Catholic students have become Orthodox. Very interesting, the phenomenon that's taking place. But I will not get into that. Then came Judaism. Judaism came in 2 waves, one in the early 20th century, but mostly, of course, when the tragedies in Germany began in the 1930s. And at first, you all know all of the very strong anti-Semitic feelings that existed. By the way, just to let you know, the word anti-Semitic was used for the first time in Spain against both Muslims and Jews. The Arabs are as much Semites as Jews are. For Jews to call Arabs anti-Semitic is meaningless. But now I know this word has come to mean anti-Jewish, but so I'm using it in that context. But intellectually, you should know what it means. Anyway, there was tremendous anti-Semitism, you all know about that. Some of it even lingers on now. But gradually, the Jewish community settled down, and it became part and parcel of the fabric of America. Now it's the turn of Islam. Islam is in the situation that Judaism was in the 1930s. The Catholicism was in the 1860s. The Orthodoxy was in the 1910s and 20s. There's a tremendous opposition to it as something alien, and that has been abetted, of course, by the negative elements that come from politics, the fact there's a whole industry to produce literature against Islam, a whole industry that produce books against Islam. People who do not know anything about Islam become famous writers. Some women in Africa, as soon as it curses Islam, becomes a full professor at Harvard, almost. You know who I'm talking about. This unbelievable what's going on. Unbelievable. People would probably flunk her if she took a course with me on Islamic thought. But anyway, this is the way the situation is. We might as well see it for what it is. For the moment, there's what's called Islamophobia, and this is a misnomer. Phobia means fear. How can you have fear of Islam when you have over 4,000 nuclear bombs? What? It's total nonsense. Fear of what? But anyway, Islamophobia has now become a popular term. So this is producing a very negative atmosphere, which fortunately the serious American academic media have not paid attention to. And the serious American scholars know that this is all the worst kind of politics, the politics of fear, from which certain people benefit, certain parties benefit. But that's there. Nevertheless, it's there. This was not there 50 years ago. The ordinary American people were very, very welcoming to the Muslim brothers and sisters, and they still are on the simple level, not only in the Midwest, which is sort of the heart of America, but also where I live, in Maryland and Washington and so forth. But a little bit higher up, among certain intellectuals and writers and so forth and so on, you know what is going on. But parallel with this, something much more important is going on. And with this, really, I want to conclude. First of all, the Pew Charitable Trust figure of 2.5 or 2.7 million Muslims in America is total nonsense. There are between 7 to 8 million Muslims in America. And they're probably, after the Jews, the most educated minority in this country. The number of doctors and lawyers and scholars that they have, percentage-wise, is much higher than the mean of the ordinary society, the big society at large. Many of them also very wealthy. They did not come here as poor people like in Europe. The American Muslims are not like European Muslims. If you go to any subway station in Paris or London, the people who sweep the stations are always Muslims. A few Hindus or Jamaican blacks may come along, but jobs like that, washing bathrooms in Heathrow, that's the job of Muslims. You don't have any Muslims doing that here. Some of them drive taxis, but so do a lot of PhDs in physics in New York drive taxis. That's an honorable job. But they're much more educated than European Muslims are. Much, much more educated. And the pressure that the Muslim families have for education is very much like the Jewish families. Muslim families are very insistent that children be educated. All Persian mothers are like Jewish mothers when it comes to this issue. They take education very seriously. And this is having a very big impact. And I believe that in the next generation, you're going to have, first of all, the Islamic community be integrated, like the Jews and the Orthodox and the Catholics were before them, into the mainstream of American society. And they will not start at the lowest rung of the ladder, like the poor Italian immigrants after the potato famine in Italy that killed millions of people, and that sweep the streets of New York and the rows and rows until they become governors and so forth. They have not started at the very bottom. They've started sort of somewhere in the middle. The problem is they have zero political power. They have a lot of economic power, they have a lot of intellectual power now, but they have zero political power, zero. Muslims don't know how to handle the American political system. They do the wrong things, they say the wrong things, but that also gradually will be solved. We now have a large number of young Muslims who are studying fields like journalism, international relations, political science, fields like that. And they're gradually now making themselves felt and known even in fields outside of the economics and the academic world. So I have a very positive view of what is going to happen in the future. Another thing that's going to happen, I believe, that's already happening. I know there are a lot of Christians in this room. I do not want to offend anyone. But Western Christianity has lost a great deal of its mystical and esoteric and metaphysical dimensions. There are now a lot of Christians who are seeking the help of other religions to revamp Christian spirituality. Some go to India. Bede Griffith, the famous English priest, spent his whole life in India, used to wear saffron robe like a Hindu sadhu. But many of them now are coming to Islam. The best example of it is a Center for the Study of Traditional Catholicism at Oxford. At Oxford University, the Anglican country that rebelled against the Pope, it's the most important intellectual center, new intellectual in Europe, Catholic intellectual center. It was founded by an Englishman, Stratford Caldecott, God bless his soul, he just died a few months ago, who came to Washington. We spent months together, in which he just tried to learn from me the intellectual and metaphysical aspects of religion. And he went and applied it to Catholic teachings. And they have a wonderful journal that comes out. Intellectually, it cannot be compared to the Osservatore Romano or the journal that comes out of the Vatican. No comparison whatsoever, intellectually speaking. And there are other cases. Cardinal Jean Richelieu, Danielou, the great cardinal of France, was my very good friend. We met many times in Paris. He's the cardinal of the church. And he wanted to learn about metaphysics, about traditional philosophy. Jean Anny, who died, the greatest theologian, Catholic theologian of France. And I don't want to burden you with a lot of names, but there are a lot of people that are going on. This is a very important phenomenon that is the leaning of certain intellectually and spiritually inclined Christians toward the inner aspects of Islam to revamp Christianity, to strengthen Christianity. I hope it will be done with honesty, with goodness, and it will benefit everybody. If it's done with honesty and goodness. That's a big if, of course, but if it's done with honesty and goodness. Finally, let me conclude with this one sentence. I believe that in the future, that not only the Islamic community, but Islamic studies in America will play a major role globally in the rest of the Islamic world, It will play a major role because of means of communication which did not exist before. It's the first time in the history of Islam in which you have a number of major Islamic scholars living outside of Dar al-Islam. That never occurred before. Never occurred before. It's a new phenomenon. If I write a humble essay, 10 days later it's in Jakarta. It's published in 20 languages. In the Middle Ages, this did not occur, and the Muslims did not migrate outside of Dar al-Islam, and those who did were not scholars. This is a new phenomenon that is taking place, and is, I think, going to increase without doubt. That is, this Islamic community in America is going to play a very important role in the Islamic world at large. Let's be honest with each other. In most Islamic countries, you either have a military dictatorship, which is against writing anything Islamic, and as the state says so, or you have a particular brand of Islamic fundamentalism, which is against everything else that you might say about Islam. You cannot write a book on Ghazali in Jeddah. It gets censored. They'll never publish it. They'll never publish it. And that's true of many other places. And then in Egypt, where the Sisi cannot ban Islam because of the strength of Islam in Egypt, but many expressions of Islam are totally banned in another way. So America affords a kind of freedom, which even Europe does not have. Europe talks about freedom. I'm in very close contact with the intellectual life of France. I know French like I know English. I've lectured there. I write in French. It's not at all like this. Yes, if I write on Mullah Sadra, they will publish it. But if major philosophical, religious debates come up, the freedom that exists in this country does not exist there. So let's thank God. And perhaps America, in spite of all the things that have occurred and now is withdrawing itself somewhat from the Islamic world, will play a very important role. But center like Dearborn, center like Washington, New York, other places, if you can train good intellectuals, first-rate intellectuals, they'll be able to say something very serious to the rest of the Islamic world, where scholars themselves there either do not know it or cannot say it. And inshallah, therefore, the future destiny of this country itself will be tied up in a profound way, not only with Islamic studies, but also with the Islamic world itself. Thank you. Yes, with pleasure.
So we have limited time, unfortunately. It's been a long day for Dr. Nasr, so we're only going to take 1 to 2 questions, and if you could keep them very brief, so questions, no long commentaries, please. If you come up to the microphones in the front.
Yeah, Dr. Nasr. I just want to thank you for...
I cannot hear you.
I hope... okay. Now, so I just want to thank you for that flowing river of information you have there. You mentioned in a previous lecture about Muslims becoming Occidentalists. I wonder if you could just briefly... Occidentalists, not Orientalists, but Occidentalists. Knowing the Occident, knowing, like you mentioned, that Muslims even being able to teach Judaic studies, or do you have any more thoughts on that, on Muslims becoming Occidentalists?
I don't understand this question, the way it's pronouncing it. I think the way I understood your question was, how can Muslims be more successful in teaching Islamic studies, huh? Is that what you have in mind? Yes. First of all, this is a long story. Could not really go into today. My time was up. But many Muslims, good Muslims, and really intelligent ones, who write about the West, don't know anything about the West. They write some silly things about the West. Some very serious people. This is an unfortunate event that shortcoming of our ulama. We have so many Catholic priests who know Arabic well, who they might say things that we don't like, but they at least are based on knowing what they're saying. How many ulama do we have who know Latin or even know one European language well? I know 2 or 3, I'm going to say there are none. Ayatollah Maqed Ahmad, for example, can read French very well, French and English both. But it's very rare. Sheikh al-Asar and also Sheikh Ali Joma in Egypt. No, they know some English, but not enough. And so we write a lot of those in the Islamic world. They have a lot of Islamic knowledge. But first of all, they really do not know the challenge of the West. They don't know really what modernism is. And all the new isms, like the waves of the ocean, come every day. By the time you come to learn about the structuralism of Strauss, it's out of fashion in France. And then somebody writes something about it in Iran. And then comes, let's say, deconstructionism, Derrida. By the time you write a book on deconstructionism, nobody in France is talking about Derrida anymore. It's a very, very difficult situation. The people in the West, Muslim scholars, are those who God has really made responsible for knowing what these trends and modes of thought are, and to be able to provide Islamic responses to them. That's what it is. One more question I will answer. آقا بفرمایید دم microphone.
This is Muhammad Elahi, House of Wisdom, and with Sheikh Hassan. Welcome you, Dr. Nasr. Very, very proud of you, and it's really a great pleasure to hear your lecture. We've been long time in Michigan. We have been waiting for such a moment that meet with you and learn from you. You mentioned Islamophobia, which is a disease, unfortunately, this country, and if you go to the Middle East, it's a Shia phobia. So we have Islamophobia and Shia phobia. And in your lecture, briefly you mentioned the causes of Islamophobia and somehow how to deal with that. But a little bit more advice from you that what would be the best way of dealing with this. We had something in the news today. You heard probably this 9th grade student from Texas, Ahmed Muhammad. He made a clock for his class. And when he showed this to his teacher, he thought that he is very proud. And his teacher talked to the principal, and they called the police, and they arrested this student because they thought that this is a bomb. So really, this is an issue that, please, if a little bit more. Thank you.
As I mentioned, there's a whole industry in this country, and millions of dollars are spent by certain people to spread disinformation, not misinformation, disinformation about Islam. And since most people were isolated from Islam, like in a little town in Michigan or Wisconsin, somewhere like that, advantage is taken of that. Now, part of this is our own fault, is the Muslims' fault. That is, of all the different civilizations of the world, terrorism is not limited to Islam. Look what's happening in Burma, what's happening in some countries of Europe. They're not all Muslims. In India, the present Prime Minister of India is responsible for the death of 3,000 Muslims in Gujarat. This fellow has now become Prime Minister of India, has his hands in blood up to here. I don't care if they invite me to India anymore. The truth is the truth. One has to say it. I'm fortunately old enough not to be afraid of these things anymore. Even when I was young, I used to say whatever I thought was the truth, but certainly not. Or so I've become a persona non grata in India. I've said more serious things in Delhi itself. But anyway, it's not unique, but there's no doubt. But there's no doubt that so many people who carry out these atrocious acts do it in the name of Islam. Look at the destruction of Palmyra. For the Western people, they might not give a darn if 10,000 people are killed in Iraq, if Najaf is destroyed, astaghfirullah. But the archaeological sites of the Near East are part of their own civilization. They look upon it a different way. For 1,400 years, Islam ruled over Palmyra. Why didn't they destroy it? These very Afghans who destroyed the beautiful statue of the Buddha in Bamiyan, had not Mahmud of Ghazna, who was famous for breaking idols, he went to Bamiyan, he saw those statues, he didn't destroy them. So we are also to blame. We are also to blame. And what we have to be blamed for is that the Islamic world has to be brave enough to raise its voice against this. Some people do, some of the ulama in some madrasas or mosques. I'm not saying nobody's saying anything. But there's such thick politics involved. This whole affair of Syria is paid for by Muslim money from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Call a spade. I say, I don't care. That's the truth. The ideas have come from the West. The arms have been sold by Western arms dealers. The money that buys the arms and organizes is paid by Muslims. Now, if we were not brave enough to clean our own house, what expectation do we have of somebody writing about Islamophobia in Ann Arbor? So I turn the criticism back to ourselves. All of us who believe in the future of Islam and Islamic civilization, we're responsible for God and the Prophet. We're responsible for our own ancestors who lived for centuries, even before Genghis Khan and Hulagu and Tamerlane and all these world conquerors who killed millions of people in my own country, Iran. But they kept on to their Islam. They never did these things. When Islam had all the power to kill all the Christians, any day, Saddam Hussein could have, even the Jallad Saddam Hussein could have put to death all the Christians in Iraq. He didn't do it. In Iran, the Armenians live and have their churches and they go their schools and they're living, not one of them gets a bloody nose. So, problem goes back to ourselves. This disease that has been created in the Islamic world, and I believe it's essentially intellectual, is by the narrowing of the gauge of the universality of Islam. By these schools, Salafi, Wahhabi, Neo-Wahhabi, all these things, which are based on the idea of never using your intelligence. Where Sayyidina Ali alayhi salam said, the greatest gift that God has given us is al-aql, is that intelligence. How many times does the Quran have to say? وَهُمْ لَا يَعْقَلُونَ, those who cannot understand the truth are those who cannot use their intellect. And these people do not use their intellect. In fact, there's no such thing as intellect. And so the rest of the Islamic world, we just cannot sit and say, oh, how terrible, another 200 people died in Syria. Look at Turkey. Turkey is very much to blame. I said, I'm not afraid of him. Mr. Erdogan is a friend of mine. I visited Turkey many times. I know him personally extremely well. He came to Islam through reading my books when I was a young man in prison, Gül, Fatah, the former president of Turkey. I'm this close to them. But what in the world are you doing? Where is your Islamic character? Why do you allow all these murderers to cross Turkey to go into Syria? So before criticizing the United States and Israel and England and so on, we should first criticize ourselves. Above all, to thine own self be true. We have to be true ourselves. Once we do that, this whole tragedy will come to an end. Once there are no longer people with names of Ahmed and Hassan cutting off heads before the television, all these Spencers and people like that in the United States, they will die out overnight. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.